I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents The Cavalry Cycle. What do centaurs think of ordinary horses? Horse care class. I always loved this bit, said Captain Fletcher, grinning. Lieutenant Sanders smiled and nodded. It was the first day of horse care class for the new recruits. They stood in a disciplined line before their officers, but wobbled on legs they had had for less than 3 days. Around them was a corral fence. Behind Fletcher and Sanders was the door to the enclosed exercise ring, containing a careful selection of calm, sweet-tempered horses and likely-looking foals. "Very good, gentlemen," said Fletcher, raising his voice to the public address volume. "Welcome to horse care class. We will start easy. Today you just meet the horses." He imparted a few basic safety rules and scanned the faces. Big, bulky Wardley and wiry little Bryce, who seemed to be friends already, smiled. Wardley almost always smiled, just happy to be alive and healthy. Bryce was just as cheerful and more excited. Fletcher knew from meeting the family 2 days back that he came from a line that had supplied horses and recruits to both cavalries for generations. He was on comfortable ground. None of the others had any experience with horses as far as Fletcher knew, not until 3 days ago when, using 6 magic arrows, he had given them all a lifelong inside view. Grave Weldon, anxious Darnley, somber Fells, and hard-boiled Carlin just waited. They had seen the horses in passing on their first day, but Fletcher knew everyone had been confused and coping with their new bodies. Only now would they be able to focus. A bit theatrically, Fletcher and Sanders opened the double doors. "Meet your new cousins," Fletcher declared. The horses came out. Fletcher watched the recruits' faces. It was like dumping a box of puppies in front of a line of small boys. Smiles glowed. Wardley held out his arms and crashed down into a sitting position to bring his head to the level of a foal, who came over to sniff him and did not shy when it got hugged. Bryce laughed aloud. A sweet old mare who had been through this ritual many times came up to him and laid her muzzle against his chest. He hugged her head and scratched behind her ears. The remaining sober 4 were sober no longer. Even wry Carlin smiled sideways and held his hand out to a yearling as if to a dog. Come on, baby, he begged it. It sniffed, then skipped away, but turned back to see if Carlin would follow. He tried, much clumsier on his new legs than was the colt, who had had a year to practice. Darnley was laughing now, his eyes alight with wonder. That meant he was noticing the change within, how these horses were no longer strange, their expressions no longer blank to him. Fletcher still smiled, but watched carefully. There was a slight danger that someone, most likely Darnley in Fletcher's estimation, would go into hysterics on realizing their mind was changed as well as their body. But no, Darnley seemed delighted. Fletcher paced over to Bryce instead. The old mare had passed on to pay her respects to Fells, and Bryce was now petting Lummy, who was probing at his waist to see if he wore a belt that might carry treats. "How do you find it, Mr. Bryce?" Fletcher asked. "It's great, sir. It's like looking through a window that got cleaned when you didn't even know it was dirty before. It's so easy. I've known horses all my life, but I didn't realize I was working at reading them, just a little bit, but working. Now I just see." Fletcher returned his smile. "What's his name, sir?" "This is Lummy. He works by food. You know the type?" "Oh, yes, sir," to Lummy. "Come on, cousin, I got nothing. It's just pettin' today." Fletcher smiled and passed on. Carlin and the colt were still playing. The colt was dancing around the new recruit, butting him. Carlin laughed back, but then said, "Hey, that was a nip, you little glue pot." The colt lunged again. Fletcher leaned in and smacked him on the side of the muzzle. "Do like that, Mr. Carlin. He has to learn manners, but not hard, just so he notices." "Right, yes, sir." Carlin seemed slow to pick up the yes, sir, no, sir form of address, but Fletcher saw no deliberate rudeness, just as the colt wasn't being deliberately mean. Fletcher retreated to the door, spread his legs into resting stance, and resumed watching. "Looks good," Sanders opined. Fletcher nodded. I was a little worried that Darnley would lose his grip, or that Carlin would understand them well enough but not like them. Carlin was, rather, following half a length behind the yearling, doing his best to imitate the colt's playful prance, both horse and man-horse with tails up, exuberant. But all's well. Sanders nodded back. A new chamber to their hearts. The dedicated cavalry is made up of men who volunteered for permanent transformation. Why would anyone do that? Captain Fletcher gives the talk. Captain Fletcher's hooves clattered over the floorboards of the barracks as he finished morning inspection and turned to face the line of new stallions. Packed earth would have been quieter, but was demeaning. Carpeting would have done too, but was expensive, especially the way hooves tore it up. The stalls were tidy and the recruits in good order. All stood at attention in the rusty red t-shirts that were the cavalry fatigues, still fresh and clean at the start of the day. Right about now, they would be wondering why he was pausing. This was because it was time for the talk. Experience had taught him that 2 months in was about the best time. He'd given the talk dozens of times, but of course it was always a little awkward. Good. At ease. The recruits eased their hindquarters down onto the floor and spread their forelegs to brace, but kept their man-backs straight, arms folded behind. There were only 6, but that was a pretty good year's recruitment for the dedicated cavalry. A bit of shaving soap behind an ear caught his eye. Darnley, how many times a day are you shaving? 3, sir. You see, yes, 5 o'clock shadow keeps coming early now. Like to look sharp? His smile was forced and faintly worried. Beards were the fashion in the cavalry now, as was often the case. If Darnley was bucking that trend, he might just be individualistic. But if he was shaving thrice a day to keep up with his new metabolism, he might be doing it for some girl, which was concerning. Which brought Fletcher's mind round to the talk again. Fletcher gazed abstractedly at Fells, the only other clean-shaven pip. Fells was even more concerning, being handsomer. He assumed Fells shaved to show off his noble profile. Not that Fletcher blamed the fellow with that jawline. Fletcher's jawline, like everyone else's, was concealed by a full beard. Fletcher knew that with his flowing white beard he looked like an athletic Santa Claus from the waist up, a resemblance enhanced by the red uniform jacket with white piping. The profile was turning pink under Fletcher's gaze, so he averted it. "It's just that my beard comes in patchy, sir," said Darnley. "Maybe it used to, but it won't since you got up on hooves." He glanced at Wardley, huge and dark, his Adam's apple already hidden forever. Wardley smiled back, or so one inferred from the rounding of cheeks and the lift of the mustache ends. Next up, agility training. But a word before you go, men, and it is as men I wish to speak to you, not as stallions. You will have noticed observers at the edge of the exercise field. Many of them are girls and young women. Carlin and Fells smiled slightly. Weldon looked unhappy. I believe some of you have talked with them. Carlin certainly had, and that's all fine. But next month you will start getting leave time some days to go into town, and I need to remind you of some things about the career and shapes and life we have chosen. By the time you took that sagita in the chest, each of you had agreed to live as a confirmed bachelor. So I'm sure the increase in female interest is frustrating as well as gratifying, especially when you're now feeling even more vigorous. You didn't pause before the word vigorous. It encouraged snickering. It's a regular thing. You'll encounter it wherever you go. A couple of you have older brothers on hooves. They may have told you about it. Or your sisters may have. Girls are often horse crazy. If the horse is also a gentleman, he often finds himself very popular. You must learn how to respond. Take a basic fondness for big, healthy animals. Add to this animal the capacity to flirt. You respond as a gentleman. Part of your new popularity is their feeling that with you, they are safe from being sexually pressured. You mean like with a gay friend? Asked Carlin, slightly incredulous. Normally pips shouldn't break in like that, but Fletcher wanted candor at the moment, and as group lectures went, this was as free rein as it was possible to get. A bit, yes, in that particular regard. And you will do nothing to disturb that feeling of safety. Otherwise, you will be punished as a man, not a beast, and to the fullest extent. It does happen once in a while, and that is how we respond. Most people know the old stories, of course, and many have seen a lot of classical art, and that puts an edge on the attraction too, but only as long as it stays good and imaginary. Technically, we're monsters, and people will remember that damned fast if you give cause, people of both sexes. The observers at the exercise field had included fathers and mothers of the girls, and they were watching the girls, not the pips. Ordinary conversation, of course, said Fletcher in the tone of one going down a list. Friendly chat, fine. Flirtation, there's two kinds of flirting, testing the waters and just for amusement. We are restricted to the latter. And that's as far as it generally goes, except for rides. Will you give me a ride? It always comes up. And everyone remembers Hartlet. Everyone in cavalry circles, at least. Hartlet had been a cavalry guard at the palace for decades and had given rides to 3 generations of royal children and their friends. One of his saddles was in the museum with photos and watercolors around it. Rides are fine if you use common sense. Give them in daylight and in public. You'll be withers deep in children after the first one. Use a saddle, more comfortable for everyone, and insist on a good saddle pad. But refuse reins. Anyone who asks you to put on reins is very ignorant, teasing, or has very specialized tastes. There, they could snigger at that one. Of course, if your tastes are the same, there's no more to be said. Can we gallop, sir? Asked Carlin. His performance on the exercise field showed he clearly delighted in this gait that was so specific to 4 legs. Fletcher thought he delighted in other things, too. Certainly, if you're confident she can stay on. Learn to gauge how tightly your riders are gripping with their knees and pay attention to where their weight is. But make sure they're up for it. No surprises. They may like the fantasy of being run away with, but not the reality. Geraldine Thurbright certainly hadn't, and it was only her suspicion, not reality. He'd been quite innocent, just picking up his pace a bit from trot to canter. His rear rib cage still twinged at the memory of her heels digging in. As you were, sir. What do you think you're up to? Expostulations and indignation from him. Deliberately insincere apology from her. The rest of the ride had been concluded with barely a word. Anything remotely like that ends badly for you. There's a copy of Hamilton's Mythology in the library. Read the stories about Nessus and the Lapiths. They're easy to find. The book falls open to them. So, you're going to be bachelors, but that doesn't mean you have no families. You won't have children, but I think you all have siblings or cousins. Most of their children will think having an uncle on hooves is amazingly cool. He knew he pronounced it with quotation marks. He couldn't help it. So, if you want family life, see as much of them as you can while you're in. That way, the contact will still be there after your stint. Assuming, of course, you survive. Scouts in the out zones had plenty of hazards. Are you an uncle, sir? Asked Fells, he of the noble profile. Fletcher was a little surprised to get the question from that quarter. Yes, by St. Martin, and great uncle. Talk about rides. I take exercise to keep from getting swaybacked. Chuckles from the pips. So there you are. Your bachelorhood is a disadvantage, but there are mitigations. I know that was very personal and awkward, but we're not quite done yet. After agility, I want to see each of you individually sometime this morning. See Lieutenant Sanders about times. Grab a bowl of mulch, then off you go. Sanders opened Fletcher's office door and looked in. First one's here, sir. Fells. Lieutenant Sanders was a rangy palomino with white blonde hair. He had a close-trimmed yellow beard, waxed to a point, and vast waxed mustaches. A usual beard was just a fashion choice, thought Fletcher, but that one is a hobby. Fletcher privately thought of him as the Triceratops. But Fletcher also suspected Sanders was subtle enough to be using his silly whiskers to a purpose, to look less intimidating. He was, after all, a 7-foot-tall, half-ton, semi-human monster, but with silly whiskers. That took the edge off, as did, say, looking grandfatherly, even if you couldn't help looking grandfatherly. Certainly no one in town was afraid of Sanders or him, as far as he knew, and that was not always true of the pips. Sanders backed out of the door, a move the pips could not yet do easily, and admitted Fells of the noble profile. He was undoubtedly gorgeous, a positive recruiting poster for scrambling your species, leanly muscled, a palomino even more golden than Sanders, in his late 20s and with that handsome face. It was no wonder he had lots of conversationalists waiting for him whenever he finished his rounds on the track and came over to the fence for a breather. How much of a problem was that going to be? But Fletcher was receptant. He had learned to recognize and trust that source of hunches, and he thought Fells looked fragile for all his athletic grandeur. The fellow had taken the Sagitta like a martyr. He paused with his barrel halfway through the door and saluted. "Have a seat," Fletcher said, indicating the pad in front of his desk. Fells sank down into a crouching posture easily. That was good. He smiled at Fletcher. "So, do you want me to grow a beard, sir?" Fletcher smiled back and waved the subject away. "Just badinage. Given all the rest you've changed, your face is your own. See what we looked like when I was in your place." He jerked a thumb over his shoulder at a picture on the wall. Fells rose and looked. 8 recruits, 4 clean-shaven, 1 with mutton chops, 2 with goatees, 1 mustachioed. "Is that you with just a mustache, sir?" "That's right." Fells looked at the arrow mounted on a wooden plaque just under the picture. "Is this your Sagitta, sir?" "Yes, it's just a stick now, of course, but it makes a good souvenir. Did you keep yours?" "Yes, sir." He came back to the pad. A man would have done it by turning on his heel. Fells couldn't do that anymore, but he wheeled in a tight arc with only a hint of coltish awkwardness remaining. He began talking at once. He was prepared for this. "It's not vanity, sir, or stubbornness. It's just that I want my daughter to know me. She's very small, 4 years old, and she hasn't seen a lot of me. Her grandparents are bringing her up here in a few days, as soon as they can make it." And that was why he hung about the spectators. He was on the lookout. "My wife died 2 years ago. I wasn't good for anything after that. I just kept grinding to a halt. My parents had to take custody of my daughter. I tried to take care of her, but, well, I'd rather not catalog those failures. I tried counseling and medication and even shock treatment. Finally, I decided to try magic, to turn into something else and get a little distance." "And is it working?" "I think so, sir. A whole new life, new body, new feelings." Especially those, Fletcher thought. "You're not running away," he said to Fells. "No, sir, please don't think that." "I don't. It wasn't a question or a challenge, but an observation. You're eager to see your daughter. That shows you're not running." "Yes, sir. They're moving here, actually, my parents and her, so I can see as much of her, of all of them, as possible." Fletcher nodded. "And they've prepared her for your change of form?" "Yes, I've sent pictures, too." "Good. Children are very accepting of strange creatures anyway." He suppressed the reflection that parents were another matter. Parents were supposed to be unchanging, axiomatic. And already her mother was dead. Would Fells make a better father as a sane beast than as a mad man? Arguably. Fells thought so too. Too late now. "If you can arrange it," Fletcher said, "let her see your face and talk to you before she sees your whole body, so she knows Da is there. There's some low hedging by the car park." Fells nodded. "Thank you, sir. I was going to probe you about the issue of bachelorhood, your understanding and plans, but we seem to have got beyond that." Fells waved a hand dismissively. "I've had love in a marriage. I don't want another. This just seals it." If this were a novel, Fletcher thought, he'd find another love against all his better judgment, and his transformation would be a hell of a plot complication. As it is, maybe the main problem is that Da is trooping off to the out zones in a few months, and, well, he leaves a good salary for support. "Thank you, Fells. I know much more about where we stand. Best of luck." "Thank you, sir." When he had gone, Fletcher glared at the folder on the desk before him. "There's nothing in here about marriage or a child or being widowed or psychiatric trouble. They just certify that he's a Crown subject in good standing, not in jail, and competent to take the oath. They give his before and after medical data and that it was me that shot him, and that's it." Sanders sighed. They want more cavalry. They want more cavalry than there are men willing to take the oath, sir. They're going to use a coarse filter. So we have these little talks. Bryce was next. Fletcher looked forward to Bryce. He came clipping in briskly, reminding Fletcher of a peppy goat, except for the bit where he stumbled in the doorway. He was a wiry little chestnut, only 6.5 feet tall. The rusty red t-shirt clashed with his coat color, but what could you do? He snapped off an enthusiastic salute and did not seem to mind at all when he collapsed through the last half of the procedure when seating himself on the pad before the desk. How did agility go? Fletcher asked, since the subject was intruding in his mind. All right, sir. Didn't knock anything over, but my time is still slow. That'll come. By the time you go home for the holidays, you'll be able to sit in your kitchen and make your family breakfast. That'll surprise Mum. I never did that before. Fletcher smiled. Your mum must be hard to surprise by now. She already has one son in the dedicated cavalry, right? That's right, sir. My brother Ed. He's the reason I joined. He likes it a lot, so I thought I would. Fletcher rested his elbows on the desk and smiled at Bryce. Same way I got in, and only for me it was an uncle. Where is he? He's master of horse at Yetzirah Thoth Station, sir. That means he can get home on leave pretty often. Barely into the out zones at all. Yetzirah Thoth was boring but safe. A supply depot as much as anything else. His parents must be relieved. But Master of Horse would be running supply caravans out to the next posts, tough, necessary, productive work, and very proper to the cavalry, of course. It was one of the things they were for. He must be pretty young for a job like that. That's what Da says. All about Ed poured out. His rank and the dates of his promotions, as well as a hero-worshipping younger brother could recall them, Ed's exploits in the cross-zone passes, funny things horses had done to Ed, funny things Ed had seen horses do. Fletcher turned the conversation a little more professional. I've taught various cousins and uncles of yours, but not your brother. Did he train here? I feel sure I'd remember him if I was on post at the time. No, sir, in France. He trained under Captain Elaine. Fletcher nodded. He knew Elaine well and saw him often. How did you feel when Ed joined up? I was pretty little. Ed and my folks tried to explain to me. I was mostly upset that he was leaving home, but I thought the part about being transformed sounded terrific. I felt kind of weird when I learned it was permanent, that Ed was always going to be... He gestured down at himself. Yes, it's a serious step. But he was happy with it, so pretty soon I was too. And here I am, sir. And we're very glad to have you. Dear God and St. Martin, if only they could all be like this little Pip. Did you take in what I was saying about bachelors? Carefully, he told himself. He's not a child. He just sounds like one at the moment for sheer joy. Yes, sir, I think so, sir. Dating is all right, isn't it, sir? It's not that different from giving rides, is it? I mean, if you think about all the before and after parts of the ride? Well, because Ed dates, you see. He has a rota of girlfriends, sort of, that he dates when he's home on leave. He doesn't lead them on. Everyone knows what's what. One of them even invited her to her wedding. Of course, she'd been off the rota for a bit, sir. Of course. I have the pictures, see? He had a belt and pouch hidden under the slightly too big t-shirt. From this, he produced a phone and began clicking through pictures. There was a shot of the altar, decked with flowers, empty and expectant. There was the bride arriving in the rental limo. There was the altar again, now staffed with a priest, a beaming young man that must be the groom, and 3 ushers, the last of which had to be Big Brother Ed. He was a larger, slightly older version of Bryce, with notably bushy eyebrows. The chestnut beard was fuller, and it seemed carefully sculpted with a bit of styling gel for the occasion. He wore a tuxedo jacket, and his forehooves wore spats and were glossy black with shoe polish. The rest of him was out of frame. Click, click, click. The bride entered with bridesmaids. The vows flickered by, and the tossing of the bouquet. Then the show paused at the recessional, Ed offering a courteous elbow to the bridesmaid he escorted, who had to reach up to hook her hand through his arm. She was trying not to laugh. Fletcher could see that all 4 hooves were polished and in spats. Now the reception. The speech and some dancing flickered quickly by. It paused. He dances? Asked Fletcher, staring. There was Ed with the bride, apparently waltzing. At least the front feet seemed to be. Yes, sir, famous for it in town, sir. Of course, he does kind of crowd the dance floor. Fletcher nodded, wondering if the redoubtable Ed had been as clumsy as his brother 2 months after transformation. And now here was Ed with the bridesmaid in his arms, leering for the lens in a modern parody of a no-good Lapith grabber, the bushy eyebrows much in play. She appeared to be kicking and laughing. Said Bryce and quickly clicked on. Fletcher mentally shrugged. Slightly edgy, but it was more decorous than the tradition of the bride throwing her garter to the ushers. He had probably just given her a bristly kiss and put her down. Now here was Ed and a different bridesmaid. She was feeding him blossoms off a bouquet, his mouth open in a grin, his head wreathed in an improvised garland. Can I eat flowers like that now, sir? Asked Bryce. About as well as you could before. Your brother's a good sport. He kept smiling but waved the phone away. The groom was fine with all this? Fletcher asked. Yes, sir. He's one of Ed's best mates. Fletcher remembered the awkward, nervous reaction of his own friends when he first came home on hooves, though they had been warned. It occurred to him that Ed seemed to put a lot of effort into making people happy to have him around. Your brother should go into diplomacy if he leaves the cavalry. From what I can see, dating is fine if you let Ed be your teacher. Bryce beamed. Having had enough of Ed for the moment, Fletcher led Bryce to tell him about the rest of his family. They were one of the horse tribes, Fletcher's private term, families with close ties to both cavalries, working civilian jobs for them and supplying a steady stream to both standard and dedicated cavalry. Bryce's family bred and trained horses for the cavalries. Do you have a horse of your own? Yes, sir, Farthing. He's a little red gelding. I'm a little worried, sir. Do you think he'll take my change okay? Fletcher's memory opened on his own first homecoming. His family was not part of the horse tribes, but they were still horsey. When he came home, changed, he cautiously approached his own old pet, Bub, not knowing what to expect. Bub had shied a bit, smelled him all over for at least 15 minutes, then blissfully rested his head on Fletcher's rump and gone to sleep. Young Fletcher, fierce new warrior man-horse, had burst into tears, because the only other creature Bub did that with was his brother Lob. They were all brothers now. I expect Farthing will be fine, even pleased. A bit wistfully, of course I can't ride him anymore. Take him for walks, that will work fine. Fletcher dismissed him. See you in horse care. Bryce might be rubbish at agility at the moment, but he was first in horse care. As he left, he paused and tried to turn in the doorway, knocking his hips into the wall. Oh, sir, sorry, sir. I meant to ask, why are new recruits called Pips? It's a nickname for Philip, which means loves horses in Greek. Pretty friendly as such nicknames go. Yes, sir. Proud to be a Pip, sir. He threw a gratuitous salute, bumped the door frame on the other side, gave another sunny apology, and left. Sanders leaned in and looked pointedly at the nameplate on the desk reading Philip Fletcher. They never make the connection, Fletcher said, or if they do, it never gets back to me. Yes, sir, we shall be tired of hearing about Brother Ed soon, I should think. I'm sure I was just as boring about my uncle at first. The brother's a lot bigger. I note that Bryce signed up the moment he could, as young as we allow them. They often have a growth spurt when they change that young. He may yet grow to match Brother Ed. I'll lay an extra feed. And we'll continue with the new lot of Pips next time.